On November 12, 1984, a retired telecommunications engineer in Slough discovered something impossible on CFAX, page 888. Nestled between weather forecasts and horse racing results sat a 17-digit alphanumeric sequence that decoded two precise orbital insertion windows. For Soviet Morlia satellites, the same pache, archived at the National Media Museum, shows what cryptognosis would later call a semantic steganography event, where British intelligence weaponized the mundane infrastructure of breakfast television to conduct psychological operations against the Eastern Bloc. How does a broadcast system designed for closed captions become the delivery mechanism for some of the Cold War's most sensitive exfiltrated data? Before we decode this digital ghost story, if you're fascinated by the hidden technical battles that shaped modern intelligence tradecraft, hit that subscribe button. This channel dives deep into the engineering decisions that turned ordinary technology into weapons of information warfare. And you won't want to miss what's coming next. The story begins not in the smoking rooms of Vauxhall Cross, but in the brutalist corridors of the BBC Engineering Research Department at Kingswood Warren. Teletext, known commercially as CFAX in Britain, and a dozen variations across Europe, operated on something called the vertical blanking interval. This narrow slice of unused broadcast spectrum occupying lines 7 through 22 of the PAL television signal carried digital packets at 6.9375 megabits per second. Each page comprised 40 rows of 40 characters, transmitted in a carousel that cycled every 20 to 30 seconds depending on system load. The technology was pedestrian, derived from telex protocols and agricultural commodity reporting systems. What made it revolutionary was ubiquity. By 1984, 11 million British households could access CFAX through modified television sets, creating an asymmetric broadcast network that Soviet signal intelligence largely ignored because it appeared too trivial for operational security concerns. The Slough incident remained classified under the official secrets act until a partial declassification in 2009 revealed fragmentary context. CFAX, page 888, officially designated for experimental transmission tests, began displaying anomalous data patterns in October 1984. The 17-digit sequences appeared at 3:47 GMT daily, persisting for exactly 90 seconds before reverting to standard test card material. Derek Ashworth, the engineer who first documented the phenomenon, initially suspected a transmission error from the Sandy Heath transmitter. His incident report, preserved in the BBC Written Archive Centre, notes, non-standard Reed-Solomon error correction patterns, suggesting intentional payload modification at source encoding stage. The language is technical, but the implication was clear. Someone had write access to the CFAX generation system and was using it to broadcast encrypted material during the lowest viewership hours. The sequences themselves employed a modified book cipher technique anchored to publicly available astronomical ephemeris data. Each 17-digit string contained 3 components: a Julian date offset, a catalog identifier from the Royal Greenwich Observatory's satellite tracking database, and a trigonometric hash that resolved to ground track coordinates when processed through spherical harmonic decomposition. The elegance was in the hiding. Soviet cryptanalysts, monitoring Western broadcast spectra for concealed communications focused on radio bands, microwave links, and encrypted teletype circuits. They had no signals intelligence collection apparatus, aimed at domestic television test pages, which were considered white noise in the electromagnetic environment. British intelligence, likely through GCHQ's J Division, had identified a cognitive blind spot and exploited it with mundane brilliance. The Molniya satellites referenced in the leaked data represented Soviet strategic communications infrastructure. Operating in highly elliptical orbits with 12-hour periods, these spacecraft provided continuous coverage of high-latitude regions, where geostationary satellites were geometrically useless. Each Molniya occupied specific orbital planes to maintain constellation geometry, and their launch windows were tightly constrained by celestial mechanics. Knowing precise insertion times gave Western tracking stations hours of advance notice, allowing optimal positioning of ground-based radars and optical telescopes. More critically, the leaked schedules revealed patterns in Soviet launch cadence that indicated operational priorities. A surge in Molniya deployments during certain periods correlated with military exercises or geopolitical tension, providing strategic warning to NATO planners. How did MI6 obtain this information in the first place? The operational chain remains partially classified, but declassified fragments paint a picture. In 1982, a KGB officer stationed at the Soviet embassy in London, codename Obatyan, began providing documents to his cishandler. Ovation worked in the embassy's communications directorate, processing encrypted teletype traffic between Moscow and residenturas across Western Europe. His access included routine administrative cables about satellite operations, considered low-value paperwork by Soviet security, but operationally golden to British analysts. The challenge was exfiltration without triggering counterintelligence review. Dead drops were hazardous. Shortwave radio required equipment, and microdots were forensically detectable. The solution was to transform the intelligence into something that looked like system malfunction. GCHQ possessed deep penetration of Britain's telecommunications infrastructure, a legacy of wartime censorship authorities that never fully dissolved. Through liaison channels with the BBC Engineering Division, specifically personnel cleared for sensitive government work, they could inject arbitrary data into the CFAX encoding chain. The technical mechanism involved substituting legitimate test page content with prepared packets at the character generation stage, before error correction, encoding, and RF modulation. The modification left no audit trail because test pages were not logged with the same rigor as editorial content. More importantly, even if Soviet intelligence had intercepted the broadcast, the encrypted sequences were computationally resistant to cryptanalyses without the ephemeris key, which changed weekly based on published but obscure astronomical tables. The operational tradecraft extended beyond mere data transmission by encoding launch windows rather than actual satellite positions. MI6 achieved plausible deniability. If the Soviets discovered the leak, they couldn't definitively prove the source was human intelligence versus technical collection from Western tracking networks. The information was valuable, but not compartmented at levels that would trigger immediate mole hunts. It sat in that perfect espionage sweet spot, significant enough to aid Western strategy, ambiguous enough to frustrate Soviet counterintelligence. The CFAX vector added another layer of misdirection. Even if the KGB suspected a leak, investigating broadcast television engineers would seem absurd compared to traditional espionage vectors. The operational lifespan of the CFAX channel was brief but consequential between October 1984 and February 1985. Approximately 120 distinct launch window sequences were broadcast. Analysis of Soviet satellite deployments during this period shows correlation with Western tracking preparedness. NATO ground stations achieved radar lock on 73% of Molia launches within the first orbital pass, compared to historical averages of 41%. This improvement gave Western signals intelligence critical early access to new satellite transmissions, allowing cryptanalysts at NSA and GCHQ to capture initial handshake protocols before Soviet operators fully secured communication channels. Several Molniya satellites from this era were later determined to be partially compromised, their traffic readable by Western listeners due to procedural errors during commissioning that were only detectable with advance warning. The operation collapsed not through Soviet discovery, but due to internal BBC security review. In March 1985, a routine audit of test page transmission logs identified discrepancies between authorized content and actual broadcast material. The audit was unrelated to intelligence activities, instead triggered by engineering concerns about transmission quality ahead of an international broadcasting standards conference. When discrepancies emerged, BBC security flagged the issue to the Home Office, which quietly shut down the channel. Ovation was exfiltrated to Britain shortly thereafter under diplomatic cover. His access to satellite schedules having been reassigned within the KGB, the operation was considered successful by Sysmetrics. High-value intelligence obtained, source protected, capability preserved for future use. But here's where the story enters stranger territory. The kind of technical archaeology that doesn't fit neat intelligence narratives. In 1998, a group of retrocomputing enthusiasts began digitally preserving old CFAX pages from VHS recordings archived by the National Media Museum. When they processed the 1980 for 1985 test page corpus, they discovered something the original operators might not have noticed. The 17-digit sequences weren't just appearing on page 888. Faint echoes, partial sequences, truncated to 9 or 11 digits, appeared on 17 other pages scattered across the CFAX index, always during the same 347 transmission window. These fragments were too corrupted for cryptographic use, but their existence suggested the insertion mechanism was bleeding across page boundaries, possibly due to buffer overflow in the encoding hardware or deliberate redundancy to ensure reception. More intriguingly, the Red Solomon era correction codes surrounding these sequences showed non-random structure. Standard CFAX used a shortened RS code capable of correcting up to 2 symbol errors per packet. The anomalous sequences displayed error correction patterns consistent with intentional symbol substitution at the 8th and 16th positions, creating what cryptographers call a subliminal channel within the error correction itself. This would allow transmission of a secondary, lower bandwidth data stream hidden inside the mathematical scaffolding meant to protect the primary message. If this interpretation is correct, and several academic papers since 2003 have argued it is, then the Molniya launch windows were merely the visible payload. Something else, still unidentified, was being transmitted in the error correction codes themselves. One hypothesis, advanced by Dr. Eleanor Roth at the Cambridge Security Program, suggests the subliminal channel carried authentication tokens. Each 17-digit sequence could be independently verified as genuine by checking whether the error correction symbols contained a valid cryptographic signature derived from GCHQ's daily key material. This would prevent Soviet deception operations from injecting false launch data into the CFAX, a concern given the minimal physical security around the BBC transmission infrastructure. The authentication method would be undetectable without knowledge of the signing algorithm, effectively creating a broadcast system with built-in message integrity that looked like random error correction to outside observers. The elegance is almost mathematical poetry, using the noise-fighting mechanism of digital transmission to hide proof that the noise itself is meaningful. By 1986, CFAX's architecture had evolved. The BBC introduced enhanced transmission protocols, increasing data rates and adding new page linking features. These changes inadvertently closed the technical loophole that made the 1984 operation possible. The new encoding chain included automated integrity checks that would flag unauthorized content insertion, and transmission logging became comprehensive enough that covert modification would leave forensic traces. Simultaneously, satellite tracking technology improved dramatically. The introduction of phased array radar systems like Jihad's gave Western intelligence near real-time orbital surveillance capability, reducing reliance on advance warning from human sources. The strategic value of leaked launch schedules diminished as technical collection caught up, yet the CFAX operations legacy persisted in operational doctrine. Intelligence agencies worldwide studied the case as an exemplar of infrastructure appropriation, where existing civilian systems are repurposed for clandestine communication without their operators' knowledge. The method was particularly appealing for denied areas where traditional spy tradecraft faced overwhelming counterintelligence pressure. If you could inject data into systems the adversary considered beneath suspicion, public transportation displays, lottery results, weather data, you created communication channels that were both hidden and plausibly deniable. The CFAX precedent inspired numerous similar operations throughout the late Cold War, most of which remained classified. The technical question that haunts signals intelligence historians is whether the Soviets ever detected the operation. No declassified KGB or GRU documents reference the CFAX channel, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Soviet signal intelligence was sophisticated, operating massive antenna arrays at sites like Lords in Cuba and Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam that captured virtually all Western broadcast emissions. The data volume was overwhelming, requiring computational triage to identify priority targets. A fleeting anomaly on a British test page, transmitted at an hour when most Soviet listening posts were focused on military communications bands, could easily have been logged, filed, and never analyzed. Alternatively, Soviet intelligence may have detected the operation, recognized it as espionage, but chose not to react in order to protect their own penetrations of Western intelligence services. In 2009, during the partial former MI6 officer Thomas Harding gave a rare interview where he cryptically acknowledged creative use of telecommunications infrastructure during the final decade of Soviet power. When pressed on CFAX specifically, and hadn't that the most effective covert channels are those where even confirmation of their existence would require revealing capabilities you wish to protect. The statement is pure intelligence tradecraft. Never confirm or deny in ways that illuminate your methods. But Harding did offer one tantalizing detail. He mentioned that similar operations continued into the early 1990s, using successor technologies to analog broadcast, suggesting that teletext's digital descendants carried classified material well after the Cold War's formal conclusion. Which brings us to the technical speculation phase, the part where documented history meets informed conjecture. If we accept the subliminal channel hypothesis, what could have been transmitted beyond authentication tokens? One possibility involves cryptographic key distribution. Quantum key distribution didn't exist in 1984, but the core problem it solves has always existed. How do you securely distribute symmetric encryption keys to assets in the field? Broadcasting keys inside error correction codes offers a solution. The key material is hidden in plain sight, transmitted to every receiver simultaneously, yet only extractable by parties with knowledge of the encoding scheme. An MI6 officer in Moscow, with a modified CFAX receiver, could obtain daily key updates without any physical exchange or electronic handshake that might be detected by KGB surveillance. Another speculation concerns the 17-page echo pattern. If the partial sequences appearing across multiple pages weren't encoding errors, but deliberate redundancy, they might constitute a form of a resilient broadcasting. Imagine a scheme where the complete intelligence payload is fragmented across multiple pages, each carrying redundant pieces, such that any subset of pages is sufficient to reconstruct the full message. This resembles fountain codes, or rateless erasure coding, concepts formalized in the late 1990s, but theoretically possible with 1980s mathematics. Such a system would be extraordinarily robust against jamming or selective transmission failure, ensuring the intelligence reached its destination even if Soviet counterintelligence managed to disrupt specific CFAX pages. The orbital mechanics dimension adds another layer. The leaked Molniya insertion windows weren't just times, they were windows, plural. Each satellite required multiple possible launch opportunities across several days to account for weather, technical delays, and strategic considerations. By broadcasting all viable windows, MI6 wasn't just giving tracking stations advance notice, they were revealing Soviet decision-making patterns. If a satellite launched during the third window instead of the first, that choice encoded information about operational pressures, technical readiness, and strategic priorities. Over time, pattern analysis of which windows were selected could reveal doctrinal preferences and logistical constraints within Soviet space operations. Intelligence far more valuable than the raw launch date itself. Consider the electromagnetic environment of 1984 London. The city was saturated with RF emissions, a chaotic soup of television, radio, radar, and telecommunications. CFAX signals radiated from Crystal Palace, Hemel Hempstead, and a dozen other transmitters, their coverage areas overlapping in complex interference patterns. Soviet signal intelligence satellites in low Earth orbit would capture all of it, recording everything for later analysis. But the sheer volume was pitiful. Terabytes per day of mostly irrelevant civilian communications, requiring enormous computational resources to process. The genius of the CFAX operation was hiding the needle in a haystack so large that even knowing a needle exists doesn't help you find it. The Soviets didn't lack the technical capability to detect the operation. They lacked the analytical capacity to separate meaningful signals from the background roar. There's a final element worth examining. The human factor. Someone at the BBC Engineering Research Department, cleared for sensitive work, had to physically modify the CFAX encoding equipment or software to inject the covert sequences. This person would know they were participating in intelligence operations, but likely wouldn't know the specific operational details or the human sources being protected. This compartmentalization is standard tradecraft, but it creates interesting vulnerabilities. If that engineer was ever identified by Soviet intelligence, even decades later, they become a thread that could unravel the entire operation. The fact that no public defector testimony or KGB archive has ever mentioned the CFAX channel suggests either the operation remained undetected, more intriguingly, that discussing it would reveal Soviet sources or methods they still wish to protect. The operation raises broader questions about the nature of covert communication in the information age. As civilian infrastructure becomes more complex and interconnected, the opportunities for hiding intelligence traffic in plain sight multiply exponentially. The Internet of Things, with billions of devices constantly transmitting telemetry and status updates, creates a communications haystack that makes 1984 London look like a quiet village. Modern steganography can hide gigabytes of data inside firmware updates, streaming video compression artifacts, or even the timing of network packets. The CFAX precedent demonstrates that intelligence agencies have always been willing to exploit civilian systems this way, and there's no reason to think the practice is diminished. If anything, it's become more sophisticated and harder to detect. So here we arrive at the unresolved core of the story. The CFAX operation of 1984 was simultaneously brilliant tradecraft and a historical accident, only possible because of a narrow window where broadcast technology was digital enough to carry hidden data, but not secure enough to prevent unauthorized access. We know it happened. We know it worked. But vast swaths of operational detail remain classified. The subliminal channel hidden in error correction codes, the 17-page echo pattern, the potential for ongoing key distribution. These are educated speculations based on technical analysis of preserved data, not confirmed facts. And that's where it gets interesting. Because if the operation was really just about broadcasting Monia launch windows, why keep so much classified 40 years later? Launch schedules for satellites that deorbited in the 1990s pose no current intelligence risk. The tradecraft is obsolete, replaced by modern digital steganography techniques. Yet substantial portions of Operation CFAX, assuming that was even its real designation, remain under seal. What was transmitted in those error correction codes? Were there other broadcast channels we haven't discovered? Did the Soviets know all along and feed disinformation through the channel? The archive at Kavarsham holds 300 hours of CFAX recordings from the 1980s. Most never digitized or analyzed. Those VHS tapes contain every test page transmission, including the anomalous sequences and their mysterious echoes across the page index. With modern cryptanalysis and machine learning techniques, what else might we find hidden in those 40 rows of 40 characters cycling endlessly through the vertical blanking interval? And perhaps most intriguingly, if you knew where to look and what patterns to search for, could you find active covert channels still operating in broadcast infrastructure today? The Slav engineer's report remains in the BBC archive, a mundane document about transmission irregularities that accidentally documented one of the Cold War's stranger technical operations. 17 digits, 90 seconds, a satellite launch window that became something more. And in the elegant mathematics of it all, the careful engineering that turned breakfast television into a weapon of information warfare, we see the real legacy of the Cold War's intelligence battles. The understanding that any system, any network, any piece of civilian infrastructure can be appropriated for purposes its designers never imagined. What do you think was really being transmitted in those error correction codes? Drop your theories in the comments below, because the more we examine the technical evidence, the less the official narrative explains. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden technical history of intelligence operations, the engineering decisions that shaped modern espionage, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories don't just reveal the past. They illuminate how information warfare continues to evolve in the infrastructure all around us, invisible but always transmitting.